Hi everybody, welcome to your final session of the day. I hope you've had a brilliant time already. My name is Elisa and I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Tower Hamlets and also the Socialist Workers Student Society at Queen Mary. So I'm sure you've heard it all before today, but I'm just going to explain how the session's going to run. So our speaker's going to speak for about 30 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion together, and then we'll come back for the main discussion. You can make contributions, and then I'll just give a few announcements before they sum up. And so, without further ado, this is Student Revolts and Class Struggle from 1968 to today. And we've got a brilliant speaker, Liam Winning, who's also a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Student Society at Edinburgh University.
Right. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Chair. And I want to start by saying that over the last 50 to 60 years, students have led marvellous revolts across the world, from the system-shaking revolts of 1968 to the Soweto Rebellion of 1976, right up to the student revolts in the modern neoliberal world, not to mention at least the 2010 UK fees revolts. Students have been at the forefront of a variety of social and political movements, from the anti-war movement to struggles against racism, fascism, and so on. Often students have been the leading voices in a lot of these movements, voicing the most militant demands and enacting the most radical action, which often leads to a detonation of much wider struggle, something which could act as a massive radical alternative for today. Today, the potential for a mass student revolt is very real and can pose extreme challenges to the university sector. Students today face tougher conditions than ever before. With the marketisation of higher education, students are no longer given grants to pursue a degree, but have to shell out thousands of pounds a year, usually going into massive amounts of debt. And they suffer extortionate rents, all for education, which is more and more under attack by austerity and cuts to courses, with lecturers whose working conditions and pay are under assault. A student movement today will fight back against the worsening conditions of education, as well as the ideological battles pushed from the top. Most importantly, due to the positions that students find themselves in society, students can tap into a wider feeling of class anger that can launch a revolt away from the campuses and into a revolutionary confrontation with the system at large. And let's start by looking about how that's been done in the past. This meeting starts in 1968 because it was a year which saw the global capitalist order challenged on many fronts, from the Tet Offensive in Vietnam setting the largest military power, the USA, on a back foot, to the working class revolts, both sides of the Iron Curtain, coming to challenge the existing orders of France and Czechoslovakia. It saw the assassination of Martin Luther King and a renewed energy of the civil rights movement, which peaked at the end of 1968 with the birth of the Black Panther Party. In Northern Ireland, the movement for the civil rights dared to take on British imperialism on the streets. These huge upheavals would cause ripples across geography and time, and would live in the memory of those fighting back against the system. What runs as a common theme in many of the revolts in 1968 was the role that student revolts played on taking on the state. For the first time, university students could be seen as a danger to the capitalist system, and some even called 1968 as the year of the students. In fact, it was much, much more than that. But for one of the first times, May 68 in France demonstrated the role that students can play into tapping to much wider social forces. So in May 68, you saw the revolt of students in the Paris University campus of Nanterre, situated just west of the city, which kicked off over under-resourced university facilities, as well as petty rules enforced on campus, such as the prohibition of male students visiting female dorms. Out of this discontent, a minority of students were able to organise a radical protest on campus, which were brutally repressed by the police and the university administration. This repression would cause revolts to snowball and reach unimaginable heights. Students fought against the police on the streets night after night and were able to take control over large areas of Paris, including the Latin Quarter, which would be proclaimed a police-free liberated zone after the famous night of the barricades. Students occupied the old grand buildings of the Sorbonne, and even buildings such as the Odeon Theatre, which the students justify by saying, when the National Assembly becomes a bourgeois theatre, the bourgeois theatre becomes a National Assembly. Students taking on the forces of the state initiated a much wider revolt amongst the French working class, the likes have never been seen before or since, which would see an all-out strike of 10 million workers. It saw the government utterly paralysed, and the power of Charles de Gaulle, the president at the time, was hanging in the balance, so much so that he fled the country. The role that students played throughout the revolts was that of the often of the most revolutionary, proposing ideas of how a new society could be organised. And the event in May '68 showed the potential for students to effect change on society by acting as detonators for wider struggle. The student movement had been one in France that lagged behind in others in Europe, such as in Germany, Italy, or even the UK before '68. Movements which often emphasised the power that students themselves could enforce in society. In Italy, the student movement focused on student power, and groups of students in the UK, organised by people such as Tara Kali and the Red Wolf newspaper, called for red bases to be established on campuses. And this rallied thousands of students to revolutionary ideas and put pressure on university administration. However, these movements could not go very far, and calls for student power and for red bases on campuses did not offer a revolutionary challenge to capitalism. The experience of France in '68 would show that students' revolts could effect a massive change if it managed to step outside of the student ghetto and join forces with working class revolt. Another mass student revolt in the year of '68 was the mass student revolts in Mexico. Mexico had also seen a rapid economic growth built on a rapidly urbanizing economy and, importantly, a rapidly expanding student population. Clashes between students and the state occurred throughout '68 over democratic demands, the removal of police from universities, the disbanding of riot police, and the withdrawal of repressive laws, to name a few. The response from the state was brutal, and by August, solidarity and support for students was more or less general throughout the country. Demonstrations were 500,000 strong and incredibly militant, but the government was trying to try anything to preserve its power and stability and smash the student movement and the links it was starting to create with workers, especially in the run-up of the October Olympic Games held in Mexico. So on October the 2nd, when a demonstration was planned in the Square of Three Cultures, or known as Tlatelolco Square in the north of Mexico City, the government came prepared. 5,000 troops were stationed well before the protests, which started at 5:30. By 6:10, helicopters gave the orders to open fire on the students. Soldiers, backed by light tanks, fired in all directions. Hundreds were killed, and the lack of extensive links between students and the organised working class meant that the repression, by all counts, would smash the student movement. In '68, students were not only leading revolts against the so-called freedom of the West, but also the equally phony socialism of east of the Iron Curtain. This happened in Czechoslovakia and was to be known as the Prague Spring, which started off as an internal turmoil, which led to within the leadership of the state, which saw factions turning towards the masses to mobilize on the streets for their interests, and led to a ferment of social demands that spread across the country. And students were a key part of this. It seemed as though the whole basis of bureaucratic control of the state would be challenged, and Russian tanks were sent in to maintain order. Those who protested at this tended to be students in the main cities, and a good deal were killed as a result. Despite this, during the occupation by Russian troops, it was the radical layers of students who discussed how best to respond to the situation. After an initial university occupation on the 15th of November, an occupation movement was launched across the country. This was paired with action or a threat of action from workers. Rail workers threatened that not a train would leave Prague station if the government acted on students. In the end, occupations only lasted 3 days, as students were not prepared to take on the might of the state, but deep links were established between workers and students, so that in the start of 1969, 800,000 people were protesting on the streets, and students and workers were a massive part of this. And while the students and workers could not form a revolutionary challenge to the discontent imposed by the state, it would take away the illusion of socialism in the socialist world and show that revolt was possible all over the world, not just in the West. Another example of this was in the 1976 Soweto uprising in South Africa. In an apartheid regime, school children in the township of Soweto revolted against Afrikaans, the language of the oppressor, being made the official language of schools, and in fact dared to challenge the entire structure of the apartheid system. Starting in May, the revolts would see thousands of students taking on the police and the racist apartheid state across the country. During the rebellion, the argument that the working class had the power to tear down apartheid came to the fore. Workers were involved from the beginning as parents, brothers, and sisters of students. And sometimes the scale of the fighting made it impossible for them to go to work. But there was also a conscious element involved. Tsetse Mashinini, one of the leaders of the student movement, said that the students had gone as far as they could, so they turned to the workers in August. Students set out to organize a strike, and from the 23rd of August, around 80% of Soweto's workers struck for 3 days. Although these strikes could not fully grow to challenge the system, it would show the importance of militant working class action that could inspire the strikes, which would bring down the apartheid system in the 80s and 90s. Students again could be seen to be tapping into a wider class anger. Another example is South Africa, but this time in 2015, shows a successful revolt against the neoliberal education system, and it was South African students that took part in this. The movement, at first echoing a campaign to remove apartheid figures from university campuses called Rhodes Must Fall, exploded as it campaigned against the ANC government, the African National Conference government's decision to introduce higher university fees, and a movement coined the name Fees Must Fall. The movement was the largest social movement since the end of apartheid, and seeing thousands in the streets became a regular occurrence. Exploded as large rises in tuition fees were announced in 2015 and for the 2016 academic year. Students occupied university buildings, stormed the gates of Parliament in Cape Town, and mobilized 50,000 people to protest at the government offices in Tshwane. From the start, students were debating the best way forward, and the question of bringing workers from townships and urban centres was central in many of these debates. The speed of the mobilizations and the militant action taken by students took the government by storm, and they were forced to capitulate and announce that there will be no fees increases in 2016. The movement was broad and radical, and students not only demanded free and quality education, but decolonized education, something which would be an inspiration for student movements across the world in the coming years. And I'll finish on another example and then head to some deeper theory. But another brilliant example of students tapping into wide feelings of working class anger was in Chile in 2019. After 30 years of an ever more entrenched neoliberal consensus, protests began on the 7th of October with a fare dodging campaign by school students in the capital, Santiago, as fares were increased. As repression grew, so did protests, taking the form of both marches and riots, targeting symbols of inequality such as supermarkets, metro stations, and energy companies. The then President Sebastián Piñera declared a state of emergency on the 18th of October, deploying the military and riot police to attack protesters. By the 25th of October, 1.2 million people were on the streets of Santiago, which is a fifth of the city's population. Amid a general strike, the slogan used by students demonstrates perfectly the role that they played as a spark that lit the fuse of revolt. The slogan being, "It's not about 30 pesos, it's about 30 years." So looking at the history, it's necessary to understand why it is that revolts have the power that they demonstrate in these particular revolts. For this, we must look a little bit deeper into the situations that students find themselves in. It should be said that students have not always played a radical role in challenging the status quo. Far from it. Before the economic expansion of capitalism after the Second World War, students played a largely reactionary role in society. And during the Russian Revolution, students were a part of the forces of reaction of the departing ruling classes and their attempts to sabotage the development of the revolution. During the general strike of 1926 in Great Britain, students were used as a government as strike breakers, as scabs. The reactionary role of students reflected the social placement of students and universities, which are training grounds for the next generation of the ruling classes and a small section of the upper middle classes. And students were often destined for only the most high-flying roles in society. Alongside the administrative section of universities, as well as lecturers, universities were educational communities of the ruling classes. However, as a result of the so-called long boom of capitalism after the Second World War, fueled by an expanding arms economy of the dominant powers, universities saw a rapid expansion. The nature of the capitalist system, where profit-seeking firms compete in order to survive, which leads to a process, often leads to a process of centralization. Or as Marx said, one capitalist always kills many. This gives way to monopoly capitalism, which through the state interventions and nationalizations of the Second World War and after, becomes increasingly merged with the state. Successful capitalist accumulation of this kind and capitalist development of this kind requires the continual application of technology and science to industry, as well as a massive personnel to staff the apparatus of bureaucratic control and to maintain ideological dominance. This meant that a new layer of educated workers was needed. As a result, universities needed to expand to meet these requirements. At first, it was a slow process. From 1900, there was around 20,000 students in the UK, and they made up a small proportion of their age group. By the end of the Second World War, this is around 69,000. However, by 1972, the student population reached well over 600,000. As universities expanded into the 60s, they also changed not just in a quantitative fashion, but in a qualitative fashion, and were acknowledged by even the head of Berkeley University in California in 1964 as knowledge factories. In this scenario, universities could not be made up of the ruling classes alone. And of course, many top professors and administrators mingled with or were a part of the ruling class, as we still see today, but most lecturers and students were not in this situation. As a result, universities were no longer communities of equals, and as Chris Harman wrote in his brilliant book, The Fire Last Time, neither in class origin nor class destination were students the children of the bourgeoisie. So just because students were no longer part of the ruling class does not mean that they were a part of the working class, or any particular class for that matter. Today, the class destination of students are very uncertain. Most end up as wage laborers, and an even smaller section ends up as a professional middle class. More and more students face jobs which have nothing to do with their degree, or jobs that are lower paid, with worse conditions, and usually not matching the skills that they learned at university. So in this situation, what is the class role of students in society, and how does it distinguish from workers? Well, the way that workers are distinguished in society is that those who work for wages in order to survive, receiving less than the value that they create on a given shift. As a result, when workers go on strike, workers have the power to hit the bosses where it hurts, which is their profits. When students take action, they don't have this power, unfortunately. Just skipping our lectures won't overturn the system. It'd be nice if it did, and it probably would have happened already. But it is not the fact, it should be said that whilst there are even more students that do find themselves in work, it's not the fact that they are students that they have power, but the fact that they are workers that they have power. As a result, students cannot be labelled as a class in and of itself, but as a transitory grouping of young people in a state between their childhood and the world of work, between their class origins and their class destinations. Whilst they are studying, students have many things in common. They are grouped together in concentrated masses, subject to a grueling system of examinations and assessments, as well as cuts to spending and economic pressures. Indeed, it is the examination system which governs to a certain extent where students are placed in society after they graduate. This process, alongside the insecurity about the future, atomizes students rather than pulling them together. What results out of all of these pressures is alienation, or a sense of detachment from the control over your own life. We have seen from this alienation, from the pressures exerted on to students, that there is a possibility for revolt. This is helped by the fact that the transitory nature of student life allows for universities to become battlegrounds for ideas. Or as Chris Harman said, that the elements of the ideological confusion in society at large become magnified. Large sections of students are expected to accept the ruling ideas of society, or as Mark called them, the ideas of the ruling class. However, students often see that these ideas come into conflict with their day-to-day reality that they see around them. For example, students might say that they are pro-freedom and pro-democracy, but welcome dictators and warmongers onto campus. They might say that they care about the inclusiveness of trans people, but invite transphobic speakers to present their hate to students, as we saw in Oxford University a month or so ago with the invitation of Kathleen Stock. In the last 50 to 60 years, we have seen universities try and label themselves as democratic and liberal, but have always been firmly in the control of the ruling classes, who react to any challenge of their control to their rule over higher education with expulsions with the police or with the courts. However, many revolts in universities have not started as outright political revolts. In fact, many of the revolts of '68 were were so angry and large, mainly because they were made up of mainly non-political students who were angry at what Hal Draper, the American Marxist, called the first discovery of the chasm between the rhetoric of ideals and the cynicism of power among the pillars of society. The idea that before entering higher education, students have all these illusions or expectations of a free, open-minded world where we can explore ideas and figure out the world, when the reality is almost always the opposite, especially in the neoliberal world of education that we have today. This is the discontent where most students can be pulled into revolt. However, this non-political phase cannot last long in a revolt, and previously apathetic students can be easily radicalized. Student movements have the tendency of rising up at magnificent speed. You know, we're not tied to machines or workplaces for 8 hours of the day, and an initial minority of students can take action onto campus without fearing the apathy or the hostility of the majority, both things which workers cannot do. Thank you. Furthermore, something which was seen brilliantly in the student revolts of France in '68 was the lack of roots with the reformist bureaucracy's complete lack of roots within the studentship, which facilitated the revolt spreading and soaring as quickly as it did. However, despite student struggles having the ability to rise like a rocket, they can just as easily fall like a stone. Concessions can be made, small victories can be won, but organizations and efforts based on exerting pressures on administrations cannot last, and those taking part in struggles can become demoralized. The missing element in student struggles is the inability to damage the system where it hurts it the most, that being the profits by way of workers' action. This often means that student struggles can't be sustained, and the very pressures such as exams and so on and assessments that can cause struggles to erupt can often trap students back into their academic priorities. That is not to say that all of the energy of the struggle is lost and that students go back to unpolitical apathy, but they are often, never the same. They question the reality that is taught to them and often engage in traditions of thought and action not taught to them by their lecturers. The mass waves of radicalization, such as 1968, showed this, and those who took part, despite their losses, would go on to be militant agitators and revolutionaries in the 70s, as seen in the workers' struggle led by rank and file agitation in the UK, which toppled the Tory government. The radical students of today can very much be the militant workers of tomorrow. This is not to say that radical students themselves are not in any way ineffectual, far from it. The revolts of May '68 in France or 1976 in Soweto shows that their ultimate potential in changing society is by being a springboard or a detonator for much wider struggle and a potential revolutionary base that can attract the most militant workers away from reformist political currents. So that's a bit more of the history, a bit more of the theory. But what is it like to be a student here? What is it like to be in university today? Well, today we can see similar pressures exerted on students. As a result of the neoliberal policies of Thatcher and successive Tory and Labour governments, universities have undergone an extreme program of marketizations. Universities can now no longer be described as a public good which provides essential education, but a lightly regulated market where consumer demand takes the form of student choice. To add to the mess, austerity has reduced the funding given by the government to universities. As a result, education becomes much less accessible. And universities compete, universities compete against each other, not with the quality of education, but with how many degrees can be pumped out in a given academic year. This puts universities in the position where it is advantageous to optimize the number of students it can provide with a degree, with the smallest amount spent on labor costs, which invariably leads to a fall in working conditions, an increase in the exploitation of university workers. And because the working conditions of our lecturers are learning conditions of students, the quality of education has fallen. And another result of the neoliberal onslaught on universities is that they have become a much more difficult places to organize in politically. The NUS, the National Union of Students, is no longer really a political body. Across many universities, it is impossible to even put up posters. Many student unions call themselves guilds nowadays, and resemble corporate entities with only commercial advertising. You might be more likely to get a deal for 2-for-1 shots at a local nightclub than a leaflet for a meeting on revolution. And the issue of inflation, the cost of living crisis, does not leave students untouched either. With the inflationary crisis of the system today, prices are rising sharply and wages are rising at a much slower rate. As a result, graduate incomes will fall in real terms, but their money wages might still go up, if marginally. This affects how students can repay their student loans, as the repayment threshold for student loans was recently lowered from £27,000 a year to £25,000 a year. If this stays static, more and more students will be forced to pay back their loans earlier or even at all. And indeed, this has actually already started. Over the last year, the number of students making repayments rose by 13%, up to 2.5 million. On top of this, the maximum interest rate on student loans rose up to 7.1% last month. And average yearly contributions rose to £1,080 a year. An average graduate would need to earn up to 36% more compared with last year to keep up with the interest on their loans. It is clear, and out of this, it's clear that students are also being hit hard by the economic crisis, and the increased pressure will force many more to have to find employment during their studies, as well as an ever more desperate situation for graduates. However, I will argue that it's not all doom and gloom for those in higher education, and there is hope in students fighting back. Over the last 15 years alone, we have seen ferocious revolt in the UK and abroad by students and workers against the neoliberal education system and its injustices. As we saw in 2010 when students set fire to the Tory party headquarters in Millbank, or the successful Fees Must Fall revolt that I talked about earlier in South Africa in 2015. We need to argue and agitate for a student movement which can take back the gains of the radical tradition on campuses that were lost over the last 20 to 30 years. And this requires a combative student movement. Students must mobilize and fight for their issues. But what would this look like? Across the country, we have seen impressive rent strikes, for example, such as one in Manchester, which is incredibly well supported amongst students and even got the support of the University Colleges Union, the Lecturers Union. This is good. It goes without saying that a national university rent strike would cause massive change and would really win real gains for students. And aside from the economic issues, students have also been at the forefront of the so-called Tory culture wars, taking on their administrations to protect trans rights, to be able to hold meetings on Palestinian liberation, taking on the struggles over Islamophobia and the prevent programs put in place in universities. And victories on these fronts will bring massive confidence to student movements. It's fair to say that universities are tinderboxes at the moment, places where students are absolutely squeezed, and in the ideological battles can prompt a massive fight back. The struggle can be built amongst students, and it can also link to struggles faced by workers, most importantly. So just to conclude, students have played a historic role in leading struggles on campuses, as well as on a wider social and political scale. Most importantly, acting as detonators for wider struggle. Across the world, students have risen to the challenge of taking on the system, and out of the struggle have created networks and organizations and have thought about the best ways of doing this in order to change the world. We have to learn the lessons of history, examine why and how students have been able to make breakthroughs and tap into wide sections of the working class in the past, and aim to build on the student movement today. There is also a very big potential for the revolt caused by the discontent of students to spill over into the class anger felt in the UK today. There is a very big potential for students and workers to unite and fight. And the question on how we organise is very important and is a key part on that. So I'll finish on there.
Just going to go into discussion groups with the people around you and try and include everyone, and then we'll come back to the main discussion. Come back to the main discussion now. So if you want to speak, just raise your hand and try and keep your contributions to 3 minutes, and I'll give you a 1 minute warning. Over there.
Yeah, so it was a great speech, very compelling. And you mainly talked about protests that were quite successful and that actually affected change. It brought about change. but I wanted to just know about your thoughts on protests that haven't had as much success. So, for example, Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. I'm sure many of you here might be aware of the Tank Man image, but the students in mainland China, they argued for democracy, which wasn't there in China at the time. And actually, the protest wasn't as successful as it could have been. It had many features, a similar narrative to many of the protests that you mentioned today. For example, the military opened fire on students, and we still don't know the exact amount of people who died because of the Communist Party censorship. We know that perhaps it was probably hundreds to thousands, maybe even more. But I wanted to know, how do we hold out hope in a country like China, a country of repression, a mass surveillance state? How are we supposed to hold out hope that students can actually make a change in countries like that?
I'll stand. So I was in France recently, writing a report for the Socialist Workers newspaper, Socialist Worker. Get your copy at some point. I focused on speaking to people who are involved in the strike movement and students who are also involved in the university strike movement. And I think that it was very interesting to sort of see how we could learn from both strikers and students, and how strikers and students can interact and fight a common goal. So Liam very briefly asked the question of how can we engage, how can we interact? And a very interesting point that was made was that students have power that workers don't have, because workers are tied to their jobs. They risk losing their jobs by doing certain things that students don't risk. Students can do occupations. Students can stand in front of a bus terminal and stop people from catching the buses and actually allow strikes to fully happen. I think it's very important to use France as an example, because we saw that in France. In France, one of the main university buildings that always gets sort of transformed into a commune as soon as a strike happens is a building called Tolbiac. And it's a place where both strikers and students go. They discuss, they intermix, they communicate, and try to understand how one can help the other out, basically. And I think it's very important for us, especially in the UK, but as an international movement, to pick these things up, pick this advice up, and to actually employ it when we talk about striking, when we talk about student action. I'm a member of Edinburgh SOAS. It's very important to actually think about using these techniques and using this to actually push action forward. What else do I have to say? Something.
1 minute left, comrade.
1 minute left. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that while us as students, sometimes it feels like we're unable to actually push something forwards, because obviously we not all of us are members of the working class, not all of us are workers. We have the duty to engage, to interact, and to be sure that we support the workers' movement, to be sure that we are there to do what they can't do because it risks their safety and their job.
Thank you, that was great. My name's Sheila, I'm from Tower Hamlets, just like Elisa is, from the Tower Hamlets Socialist Worker Party branch. And I wanted to come back to your question, because I think it's really important that we try to answer that. And I think it's connected with something I wanted to talk about 1968 also being about a renewal of ideas, a renewal of the revolutionary socialist tradition. And at the heart of the revolutionary socialist tradition is understanding the nature of the state, the nature of imperialism, the fact that socialism can't come through parliament, and also for us, the centrality of the working class movement, that socialism is about workers emancipating themselves, which effectively is what Liam was talking about in terms of students connecting with workers' struggles. And one of the important lessons that we have to learn from 68 is that the ideas, majority-wise, that came out of 68 were only a partial break with reformism and a partial in the form of Stalinism, because a huge stretch of the student movement in Italy, also in France, less so, but also predominantly in Germany, was convinced that China was a socialist society of some sort, or that Cuba was a socialist society. So they actually looked to Mao, or they looked to Che Guevara. They looked anywhere other than looking to the working class. And this time, it seems to me, what this generation of students do can actually make a really clean break with Stalinism, be absolutely clear that China is a form of capitalist society, and that therefore the key to overthrowing and transforming China and becoming a socialist society is actually identical to where it is in the rest of the world. In other words, students have to mobilise and to connect with workers and have that dialectical relationship between developing their own struggles and giving an inspiration to workers, but also connecting with workers where they're at in terms of developing their struggles, because it's only when the two combine and people are clear that reform won't cut it, that regimes are not, either in this country or anywhere else in the world, aren't going to allow reform of their system. It has to be overthrown. It has to be overthrown from below. We have to deal with the left trade union leadership that sold out 68 in Paris in May, and which is holding back the struggles here, and actually sold out France recently and holding back the struggles there. So there are different positionings we have to do, but the central arguments about overthrowing the state and workers emancipating themselves and students being a central part of that process, I think, are ideas that we actually have to take out of what Liam was talking about and moving forward.
Yeah. No, thanks, Liam, for the leader. Yeah, I thought that was really good. I think I just wanted to emphasise what Liam was saying about student position in society and your position as a student and what power you have. So I think that I think definitely now most students are workers. I think there's a lot of students in this room. I'm sure people have part-time jobs and whatever. Our maintenance loans, whatever, don't really cut it. They just about cover your rent. And I think when you are a worker, you do get power as being a worker. But that power doesn't come from the fact you're a student. That power comes from the fact that you're a worker as well as a student. And I think the reality is that students actually will, even though they do have spare time, they will not have a lot of time to actually be active or organised in their workplaces as well. But I think what this does say is that students nowadays, a lot of students are students and workers, is that just how at the sharp end of the crisis that students are. If we think about the experience of COVID for students, or especially the cost of living crisis now, our rents and everything, and the fact that our universities are kind of falling apart before our eyes, and the neoliberalisation of unis and stuff. I think that, as Liam said, even if students are less organised than workers, and especially because we don't have those on student campuses the same the kind of a militant student union or anything anymore. There's not really that kind of organised space. But it does mean that students can erupt in anger and in protest and so on. And I think this can tip quite quickly, and we've seen that throughout history. And I think now, if you're thinking about all the crises, if you're thinking about I'm sure we're happy to watch the crisis ongoing in the Tory party, and we're celebrating when Boris Johnson finally jumped before he was purged. Or about the crisis of the far right and racism and stuff, and especially the cost of living crisis and inflation. I think that it probably is only time before students rise up again. And I think obviously now we have very favourable conditions for that because of the lead that workers are taking in this country and going on strikes and so on. And I think just to say about student protests and what people have been saying, I think mass student protests, even if they don't link up with strikes, and you don't see them go to the most radical end they can. I think that students go through a massive radicalisation in those protests, and they're armed with arguments about what we've been saying about reformism and so on, and they can learn the lessons of if those protests fail and so on. And I think.
Sum up, please, comrade.
Oh, did you give me a minute? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Well, what I was going to say very quickly then is that if you are a student and you want to be organised, obviously the NUS isn't there for you, but the Socialist Workers' Party is. So please join.
Down.
Yeah, actually, just kind of comes off the end of that. I think one of the things that it highlights to me is the central role that the Revolutionary Party does play in bringing together the student body and the working body. The SWP being quite unique for having such a central role in student struggle at the moment, and also worker struggle at the moment. But even more than that, I think also students now, because of the nature of the student life now being such that you are a student, but you are also a worker, you are multiple things at the same time. Students can have an impact through joining unions, through existing within the union movement, and carrying conversations about struggles that they face as students specifically, and struggles that are faced as workers while being students at the same time. And that way, despite it being a struggle now that most students have to work, there is an opportunity in that can be found in using as students join unions and talk to workers in a settings like a union, and that way you can build more easily the relationship between the student class and the working, or the students and the working class, that is required in order to have successful protest and move towards more successful revolutions in the future.
Okay, I'm from Marxism 21 from Germany, and I'm studying as well. And we have, I want to make two impressions. First, we have almost a similar situation about the political situation at universities. We don't have like that such a state of neoliberalism at universities, but it's, as you said, easier to get a free beer at campus than to put up a political poster. And the problem is that there's a shift in university that a lot of students cannot work or cannot study because of the high living cost, and going to be part-time working at cafes, at restaurants, and even more often getting 2 extra jobs. And we have a lot of students working at university, correcting exams and having part-time lectures. And there's a movement in Germany that is organizing these students and striking for a collective bargaining agreement. And I think it's a form we can, so maybe if they're similar in England, or I don't know about it, so that we can use some kind of power at the universities, so that it's different than other working strikes. There's kind of a power that comes up.
1 minute left.
Okay, yeah, that's starting. So maybe I want to discuss about organizations different than student unions, and if that's an option in your opinion. And the second impression about, you're talking about France, we were there as well, and the impression we had were that students are kind of not, they're not that active than in demonstrations before, and they're often driven by their teachers and by their professors. So maybe there's also a difference in there.
Yes, boss, you're right. I think Soweto student uproar in 1976 is a very good example of, or rather call it the locus classicus from there, of students, role students can play in dismantling capitalism, or begin the process of dismantling capitalism. Because after that, so, the picture of Hector Patterson, that, he was shot in that, holding his slain younger brother in hand. That picture went viral, in the newspaper all over the world. And for the first time, a lot of people realized the brutality of apartheid, not just, but even that the children weren't even spared. And of course, that brought apartheid government more enemies and more international sanctions, and played a big role in eventual dismantling about 40 years later, whatever. But The point today, if you look at, I don't know, I may be wrong, but as students, do you have students of such caliber today? And the capitalist doesn't help us with all this, they've given us, what do you call it, things I never had when I was a kid, this TikTok and the walkie-talkie, whatever you call it. You see, we can't even socialize anymore. I can't even, when I was younger, you could go on the tube and talk to any lady, speak to her, but today everybody's on his mobile phone. You can't even talk to people anymore. For me, we think it makes communication easier, but to me, that thing is worse. It doesn't bring to, somebody said it's a means capitalism uses to separate people, and that is true. You can't. There's a difference between talking to somebody face to face and talking to somebody on. It doesn't work like that. So because I think to me that is a problem with student organization, student mass organization to oppose capitalism. I think that is a problem. I don't know what you think.
I'm Sarah. I'm from Edinburgh, Swiss as well. Yeah, that is a really good point. I like that you bring in questions of social media because, like, for our generation, that is so essential to the way that we exist, the way that we interact with people, and as much as some of us wish it wasn't, sometimes that is really essential in the way that we interact, and that is a tool that can be used for it has great organizational capacity. I mean, a lot of Marxism advertising was done by social media, and that's a really important tool that we have to reach people. If it is used in a way, not to divide us, but to bring us together, can be a really, really useful platform, and that's something we need to, always keep within our strategy as socialists. We can't ignore technological advancements. We need to, find ways to use that. That's one thing I want to say. Something else that I've been thinking of is a very tangible example we've seen recently, or not just recently, but in the past year that I've been at university. UCU have been on strike. I mean, they've been on strike for years now in a dispute with universities. But the role students can play in a dispute such as that is absolutely essential to the success of that dispute, which we have seen in just by showing up on those picket lines and talking to your lecturers, to the staff at the university that you attend. The emotional impact of that is really significant. I've had a teacher of mine sort of stop me afterwards, weeks later, after some pickets, and say, that's really important that you're there because that gives us the courage to keep going, that gives them the support, and also just physically showing up, showing our strength in numbers is absolutely essential to our side winning. And we can bring the energy and we can bring those radical ideas as socialists and as students. That's something that we really need to see, the way that we interact with workers, because whilst we don't have that, the financial power when we're just students, I know a lot of us students are also workers, but we can't take industrial action as students, but we can be a very, very essential part of it, and we need to play our role there. So if your lecturers or anyone are on strike, I really, really encourage you must join them, because that plays such an important part.
It's really good what people have been saying, to think how the management of universities tries to divide students and the striking lecturers. It tries to treat the students as though the lecturers are doing this against you, that it's against your interests, when in fact the lecturers are doing it all in the interest of the students, trying to improve the educational quality, the funding and everything else. It's not really just about their pay. We all know that, I'm sure. And just how this kind of interacts, I think, with, as there was saying, about what I really think is the alienation of students under capitalism, and the way, capitalism, the system and within the universities is trying to alienate students away from showing solidarity with the picket lines and with the UCU lecturers on strike. Because, I mean, as we've seen from the great historical examples that went through in 68, when students stand alongside the lecturers and things, and other strikes as well, it really energizes them, and we saw that with the hot autumn in Italy in 68. But really, with this dispute, when a group of students go up to the picket line and are picketing alongside the lecturers, trying to convince other students to not cross that picket line, that makes it so strong, because the management can't then go to the lecturers and be like, oh, well, you're depriving all these students of an education, you're holding them back. When in fact the students are out there on the picket line with the lecturers, standing with them, showing physical, real solidarity. And that's, you know, a wonderful thing that's come out of this talk. But we've been seeing it, you know, within the last year at, you know, I'll bring up two examples. I'd say like Brighton and Manchester Uni, where we've seen students occupying offices and buildings at those campuses. And, you know, the UCU is able to then stand fully with all those students taking this action, because, you know, we stand for you stand for us. And I think that's just a really important point, and shows students and workers really must work together if we really want to go forward.
A couple of thoughts. Well, just one thing about social media. I think that, like, there is obviously, it's like the, you know, the most hot button topic of every newspaper is like, isn't social media, you know, destroying the minds of the young? I think realistically, I think the way we need to say it is like, neoliberal capitalism is really bad. Society's got worse and worse. And the way we interact with social media reflects everything else we know about how society's gotten worse and worse. So like, every survey you've done is like, you know, young people have less sex than they did 15 years ago. Young people have less friends than they did 15 years ago. People spend more time alone. People, you know, are more likely to say that they're lonely, that they've experienced suicidal thoughts, that they feel socially isolated. All of those things are connected. Is that we live in a society that is getting worse and worse and worse. And one of the outcomes of just the reality of neoliberal capitalism, the longer work hours people work, the, you know, massive cost of living crisis, all of those different like political and social dynamics. One of the realities of that is that people spend more time alone, you know, you spend more time like looking at your phone, or just like also consuming other forms of media. You know, people spend more time like watching Netflix than, you know, you ever would have spent on like your kind of combined, atomized, by yourself social activities that people did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's not just because the technology has advanced, it's because the way society is set up is worse than it used to be. So, like, but those dynamics, the realities of neoliberal capitalism, the way that people are made to feel shit, but all of the political dynamics that feed into that, that is also part of the thing that can make the society we live in now really explosive, because people are pissed off about that. So they might not think like, you know, I've spent the last 2 hours doom scrolling on TikTok, and that's why I'm pissed off. But people are pissed off about all of the political things that mean that sometimes, you know, you end up in your bedroom, like, you know, 3 hours later, you're like, what have I been doing, type thing. Like, so yeah, I think like things like those kind of social media things, I don't think that's not a barrier to radical change. I think Sarah's totally right that it's like, obviously these are things that are also, you know, people can say like, why aren't we talking to each other? We're all on our phones. Well, sometimes we're using our phones to talk to each other, but like these things are contradictory, but also like I think the broader thing is that they reflect something about society, and it's a thing that can both make people feel terrible about themselves, but also a thing that can be one of the things that pushes students and other groups into struggle. I also just really wanted to quickly touch on, I don't have that much time presumably, at 1 minute, about the relationship between the working class and students. And so I don't have time to do it justice, but just touch on that comrade's question that asked at the beginning about Tiananmen Square in China, because I think one of the, and you know, obviously, I think go buy one of the million books that will have a lot more to say than I do in the next like 45 seconds. But I think that one of the really key things that happened in Tiananmen Square that's really important in terms of understanding the relationship between the working class and students is obviously the working class were involved in a mass and radical sense in the protest that happened in Tiananmen Square, both in the square and in the like 400, you know, other cities and provinces that those protests took place. But the leadership of the student movement in Tiananmen Square was not for the joining up of the student and worker struggle. And you see that in the rejection of, you know, when martial law was declared, the biggest workers' union federation wanted to call a general strike, and the student leadership said no. And it took 10 days before the student leadership agreed that a general strike should happen and that workers should participate in that mass sense. And that was a really important political moment. And I think there's a lot of things that are really specific about China and also about, you know, politics 80 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 years ago, whatever, I can't count, that led into that. But I think it also makes another really important point that a lot of comrades have touched on, is that worker struggles can be incredibly radical and spontaneous and dynamic, but it is not always the case that that organically leads to a meeting up of working class politics. And that is also part of the reason why students in the SWP are active on their campuses, and that we don't just go along passively to things that go on. We do the things that some of the, you know, comrades were just talking about going along to picket lines, arguing for working class politics, arguing for solidarity with workers. That is not just, you know, it's not a moral good, it's arguing for a set of politics, which is about, you know, taking the strength of the radicalism of student movements, but channeling them into a set of politics that can actually transform things in a more like genuine and systemic way.
So we only have time for one contribution, so I'm sorry if you've put your hands up and not been able to speak.
Comrades, I'm going to make a third contribution about China because I think it's a really, really fertile area for discussion. See, I was a student in 1989. I was in Socialist Worker Student Society, and I remember the thing happening. I remember the immense sense of hope. I remember the immense sense of the punch to the chest when the massacre happened. I also remember, talking about social media, a couple of computer students coming up to us and saying, there's this amazing new thing where one computer in one country can talk to another computer in another country, and we're going to send a message of support to the students in Beijing, which kind of shows you how old I am and how long ago that was. But what I wanted to say, in SOAS then, what did we do? We weren't just passive observers. We didn't just say, it was great, we looked at it, and then it was defeated. We got some Chinese students who supported the protests to a student union meeting. We got them to speak from personal experience about what was happening in China, and the student union passed a motion of solidarity. Not the biggest or most important thing in the world, but we were orientated upon activity. Second thing, no struggle is ever defeated. You should never ever say, oh, I wish we hadn't done that. However bad the outcome is, to say, I wish we hadn't done that is the wrong way of looking at it, comrades, because every struggle leaves a legacy. Why was it so important for the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities to remove the monument to Tiananmen Square? Because it's an indictment stretching over the years of their handling of the student revolt and their handling of the people they nominally represent. So no struggle is wasted. And you saw it again. You actually see it in the other struggles that are happening in China. The fantastic struggle last year, when everybody goes on about how chauvinistic Han Chinese are. Han Chinese people rose up in solidarity with Uyghur people who were killed in a fire. Fantastic upsurge. Now, what's missing? What's missing is an organisation like this. What's missing is people like you able to lead that organisation. The truth is, we're not big enough in this country either, so we need to be bigger here because we need to have that understanding of how all these things connect up. The class analysis of China that Sheila talked about, the bringing together of workers and students, that's what a revolutionary organisation is about. I have no doubt that at some point one will be built in China. But at the moment, our business, I think, is to do one here. If you're not in the SWP, I joined 40 years ago. I've never for a single second regretted it. Sometimes there are ups and downs, that's the truth, but actually we're building something that will last, that will change the world, and be part of it, comrades.
Great contribution to end on, and I'm actually going to say, if you haven't signed up yet, please go and do so. It'll be the best decision you ever make. And just a few announcements. If you're interested in what we've talked about, please go to Bookmarks and get this book, The Fire Last Time by Chris Harman, who was a leading member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And at 7 p.m, the opening rally is going to start, where we'll be joined by Chris Smalls, who is unionizing Amazon in the US, Amar Anwar, who's a justice campaigner, and Marsha Rigg, and many more. And that's at the Friends Meeting House, which is a 5 to 10 minute walk from here. Also, if you have left any luggage in the luggage room, please get it before the opening rally and not after. And we'll just go to our speaker here to sum up.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was a really fantastic discussion. I think there was lots of really important points raised. And I'll try and get to most of them I can. If not, then we can chat about it in the pub later. And I want to start by talking about what the people have raised about the economic conditions that students find themselves today, because I think it's really important to talk about the positions that we find ourselves today. I talked a lot about 1968 and all these fantastic revolts in the past, but the truth is that today, the way that the education system looks is very, very different. And I think it's fair to say that comrade that was sitting on that side of the room, is now gone, was talking about is that students are on the sharp end of the economic crisis. Students are expected to pay rents, get enough money to pay rents to pay back their loans, to pay for the rising cost of food, the rising cost of living, all whilst also being in full-time education. And obviously this is a bit of a jigsaw, it's a bit of a puzzle which doesn't really seem to fit together. And of course students will have to find ways to satisfy those needs and ways to have to pay for their bills and so on. And of course many students are forced to find work. But the truth is that students, whilst they're working, is not the same as saying that students are workers immediately because they have a part-time job. Of course, they're workers in the sense that they're exploited for their labour and they're exploited by their boss and so on. But students can often find themselves in a position which is really difficult to organise in a way that most other workers have been able to organise. Students, of course, have to take time to dedicate to studies, otherwise they find themselves perhaps not being students anymore. And the fact that those that find themselves in part-time jobs, if you work 20 hours a week, it's much more difficult to participate in a strike than someone who works 40-hour weeks and so on. But I think it's really important to touch on this point of the economic pressures that students find themselves today. And it's also important to say that it's not getting any better. There's no policy from either Tory, Labour or Lib Dem that proposes removing student fees or even making the repayment threshold any higher. And I think this kind of shows the need to and the immediate need to fight back and the immediate need to take back those gains and take back what was ours. And I think what was really important is about looking at how that's been done in the past and how that's been done by a number of students in the past. And I also want to talk about what people were talking about around alienation and what a lot of students find themselves in, questions of social media and so on. And I think it's not just the fact that, students have to live in a horrible society, which, we see that the rising cost of living, the climate catastrophe, having no solution in sight and so on. But it's also the fact that a lot of the revolts that have sprung up in the past, from the 60s to today, have involved a number of students who were at first completely unpolitical. For example, there was a so-called Marxist theorist at the start of 1968, André Gorz, who's French, he talks about how there is no potential in European capitalism for a crisis that will spur a mass of workers to a revolutionary general strike. And that was in the start of 1968. A couple of months later, 10 million people on a strike and the government is almost toppled. And I think it goes to show how the apathy that the students find themselves in, the alienation, is a double-edged sword. I think on one side, students are inactive and students are not able to find themselves having to dedicate their time to academic priorities rather than think about the ways that they can fight back. And, I think if you walk around campus and have you ever tried to give out a leaflet for any meeting on any political topic, you find that the majority of students will simply not even say anything to you. And I think it's because of the alienation that we find ourselves in, the fact that the examination system atomizes people and brings people away from meeting with each other and so on, and keeps people concentrated solely on themselves and on their academic pursuits, rather than this shared experience of exploitation, which compels people to fight together, like you see with workers' struggles. There's the fact that apathy, however, is not stable. And it's a massive contradiction, as the comrade in the back pointed out. On the one side, students are completely apathetic and they're not moving at all. But on the other side, there's a massive amount of bitterness and a massive amount of suffering that students have to go through. And it's in the way that students can act and the ways that students can lead struggles that people can be pulled out of this apathy and into the direct confrontation with the powers that put them in this situation in the first place. And it was Tony Cliff, who's one of the founding members of the Socialist Workers' Party, that said that apathy is just actor directed inwards. What people perhaps who experience this need in order to escape this apathy is a way to fight, a way to direct their anger, where usually that doesn't seem possible. And here I think we see this in a lot of the revolts. I think, 2 years before the revolts in South Africa in 2015, students were absolutely unpolitical and no one was moving. And it goes for the similar revolts. But I think what is central as well is the question of organisation and the fact that students who are political and students who are leading struggles on campuses can't be doing that by themselves. And I think people talked brilliantly about the need and the need and the evidence of students, workers linking together and fighting together. However, it's not exactly inevitable. You know, it's not just a given that students and workers will get angry together and go and storm the gates of Parliament. The linking of working class militants and radical students doesn't happen that way. You know, it requires organisation. And here I'll argue that, you know, a revolutionary party which aims to organise the most militant sections of the working class, as well as students, to carry revolts forward to their most radical conclusions can do this. And I want to talk a bit about the experience of 1968. The author of this book, Chris Harman, talks about, as Elisa pointed out, is a founding member and one of the founding leading members of the Socialist Workers' Party. And as a student in the LSE, you know, not far from here, in the late 60s, Chris Harman agitated amongst students to support the Barbican Builders strike of 1967. You know, sometimes handing out leaflets saying, you know, calling for people to support the strike. And saying leaflets entitled, you know, "Are you a scab?" Some students didn't even know what the word scab meant, and these were students who were fighting, you know, calling for student power. And what this did, it enmeshed and directed students to the workers' movement, acting as revolutionaries in their own right, seeking to support the demands of the working class in the knowledge that at any time they can seek to overturn their initial aims and present a revolutionary challenge to society at large. But also that this is a process not guaranteed, and the contradictory and unhomogeneous nature of the working class means that there will be points in struggle where revolutionary analysis and strategy is needed. Here, the revolutionary students can play a key role in a revolutionary party, but also in creating links between the most radical workers and students who will be ready to agitate and support their own struggles in return, knowing where student revolt can lead to if they can be allowed to inspire and tap into a wider level of working class revolt, as was mentioned with the recent university college and union strikes in the last year. And I'd argue, if you want to transform society, you have to be part of a wider organisation that aims to draw together the most militant workers as well as students. And such an organisation must win individual activists to see that their struggles are not just individual issues, but they are particular fronts in a struggle against the whole system. The existing system maintains its power by a combination of economic, political, and ideological domination. You cannot fight it politically, you cannot fight it economically, without also supporting every act of resistance against its attempt to make workers and students pay for its crisis. Nor can you fight it without taking on the ideas promoted by those who run the universities. And I would argue that this is what the Socialist Workers' Party tries to do and what Socialist Workers' Student Societies try to do. And if you want to fight against war, against racism, against exploitation of the mass of people by small ruling classes, against the accelerating climate crisis, then I urge you to join us, because the struggle is certainly one that needs to be fought and certainly one which needs more people in it. So I'd urge you to join us, and thank you.